Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Dr. John Gentry, who is an adjunct professor with the School of Defense and Strategic Studies at Missouri State University. He writes regularly on intelligence topics and security issues more generally. Dr. Gentry has an economics background and received a PhD in political science from the George Washington University. His most recently published book is Neutering the CIA: Why U.S. Intelligence versus Trump Has Long-Term Consequences. John Gentry, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Well, thank you. I look forward to our conversation.
Likewise. And so the conversation I'd like to have with you today, John, will cover your expertise on topics such as active measures, reflexive control, and useful idiots. But before we get into these topics, could we start, please, by getting your assessment of our strategic landscape, or if you prefer, your overall comment about the times in which we live?
Well, indeed. As you mentioned, I'm a longtime intelligence student and practitioner. Been well aware of Soviet active measures and foreign influence operations on the United States for a long time. But starting in 2020, we began to see some significant changes in the United States that I thought then and still think are emblematic of successes of foreign influence operations in the past. So where I think we are strategically from the information perspective is a situation in which finally we can I think reasonably say that foreign malign influence operations are beginning to have an effect on the United States. And I've reached the point where I think we're at an existential threat situation.
I see. So the Soviet Union collapsed and went away as we know it back in the early 1990s. But what are your thoughts on former KGB agenda items that are actually still in play even today?
Certainly, this on the face of it will seem kind of odd, as virtually all of your listeners will know, the Soviet Union no longer exists. But yet the influence operations that the Soviets started in the 20s with the Communist International, the Comintern, and then later on with the KGB still exist. So in 1960 there was an acceleration of this program, and a number of the activities that Soviet intelligence and the Soviet government in general facilitated still exist and are still influencing the United States. So, for example, the Communist Party of the USA started in the 1920s. It was a Stalinist party, supported the Soviet Union. It still exists, and it still does influence operations. The Soviets created front organizations generally in the West that put their political views, emphasis on disarmament of the West and NATO. Some of these still exist. The most prominent of them is the World Peace Council, formed in 1949, which still exists and still blasts NATO from Athens, Greece. And the Soviets also did a lot of influence operations in the course of their existence, their last 30 years in particular, that still affect us. So they altered the concept of the United States' place in the world, of the specifics of events that transpired, and these perceptions are still in place in the United States. So the Soviet influence is still very significant, and in the context of influence operations, I discuss the Soviet Union in the present tense.
I see. So what you were describing, how does active measures graft onto what you were just describing? And also maybe if you could take just a moment to explain what active measures are to those who might not be as familiar with the concept.
So active measures was a Soviet term. The Russians still use it. It was a term that was developed to indicate a broad variety of actions that would be used to defeat and destroy foreign enemies. Mainly, these involved influence operations, information operations, or the spread of disinformation. Not the only thing. There were some physical violence type things, assassinations as well, but disinformation was a key part of it. So disinformation is again a Soviet term that refers to the passage of information that is purposefully incorrect. So it's not a mistake. It's not misinformation, which is simply erroneous information. Disinformation is designed to confuse or to disorient or to deceive targets.
I see. And so you would say that active measures is part of today's active measures are an extension of the former Soviet Union KGB agenda.
Yes.
Okay, got it.
The Russians are continuing this to some degree, but adding their own wrinkles to it.
I see. The other influence technique that I guess I wanted to tease out, and now might be a good time to bring it into the mix, is reflexive control. Could you maybe contrast reflexive control with active measures? And also the same thing. Please first describe what it is and its heritage.
Reflexive control is a Soviet and now Russian term that refers to efforts to get targets to make independent decisions consistent with the interests of the attackers. So in the Russian case, that means they're trying to do information operations broadly defined, including disinformation, to get target military and political targets, that would include societies, to act in ways consistent with Russian interests, but to do so without knowing that they are making decisions that favor the Russians. So it's an effort to confuse decision-making processes, to influence decision-making processes of targets without the targets knowing it.
So would you consider reflexive control to be adjacent to active measures, a subset of active measures, or how would you put both of those into the same onto a piece of paper in relation to one another?
I'm not sure I've ever seen anybody writing on that. My own view is that reflexive control is a part of what the Soviets considered to be active measures. And in fact, even though reflexive control is now a term the Russians use, its heritage, so far as I can tell, goes back to the 1950s. So the Soviets were developing this technique as part of their active measures program.
I see. Do you have any thoughts on how the Soviets or Russians, for that matter, actually analyze their targets in order to assess what the best engagement strategies are? So, like, for example, we talk frequently about how they sowed discontent within our political discourse during the 2016 elections. That's just like the shiny object that everybody understands. But if I'm understanding you correctly, there's a pervasive campaign which goes well beyond just quote unquote meddling in our elections and trying to screw things up that way. So, but backing that up a couple of clicks, how do they go about deciding where to target, who to target, how to target them? Do you have any thoughts on any of that?
Sure, there is a fair amount of history on that. We know that this early version of active measures goes back to the 1920s. So the Comintern, the Communist International, had Soviets and communists of other nationalities who lived in their target countries, understood culture, understood the education processes, and so on, and tried to identify exploitable vulnerabilities that information operations could affect in ways consistent with Marxist interests. And the Soviets then, as well, in the U.S. context, dealt with the Communist Party of the USA. They got input from American communists. They had lots of intelligence officers who lived abroad, who were sharp people, who understood the cultures in which they lived. And then later on, during the formal active measures campaign, starting about 1960 or so, there was at least one that varied over time, size and name and so on. But there was a formal organization within the KGB that was dedicated to studying target countries and actually creating disinformation documents that they would then feed to receptive journalists and others in target countries who would be the final agents of influence.
So, something that to me seems like a necessary but insufficient, or necessary for sure. I'm not sure whether insufficient is correct, but necessary step is to have people, analysts, leaders who are intimately familiar with the culture that they're interested to engage with. So, sticking with the Soviet Union or Russia and the United States, there are Russians, presumably, who are, experts on U.S. culture and all aspects of U.S. culture, and so that in order to identify, what levers to push or pull and where to engage, you have to be able to understand, what it is that makes a society tick. Would you say that that's correct? And then also, how do they go about doing that?
Well, absolutely. I think that's correct, and they do that through many of the means that I've been talking about. So their intelligence officers played a major role in this. Would often spend multiple years consistently in a given country, and I was struck just a little over a year ago, July of 2022, that the Justice Department issued an indictment against Russian FSB intelligence officer who had been apparently an illegal in the United States since at least 2014. So he had just left. So he was in the United States at least 8 years, 2014 to 2022. The KGB had a massively complicated and sophisticated educational program to train their officers before they went overseas. They would even train some of their people to master dialects of subdialects, regional accents of the languages of the countries to which they were going to work in. So the Soviets worked very, very hard to understand their targets. They looked for vulnerabilities to exploit, and their local compatriots were helpful in providing some insights to them as well.
I see. I've got two little stories that made an impact on me. Or I keep thinking about these two items. One is from Hollywood, and so I mean maybe there's a little wrinkle of truth in it, but the other is not. But the first though, there was a series on television called The Americans. And Americans was misspelled, but it was a Russian couple that were embedded in the United States, I guess doing the kinds of things that you were just describing. But the story had, was a very intricate series over like 4 or 5 years, and they would have flashbacks to previous periods in their life and whatnot. Anyway, one of the flashbacks was, must have been like some of their agent training, where just like you were describing, there was like a mock-up cocktail party with all of these Russian agents who were in training, and they were pretending to be Americans at an American cocktail party in like the 1950s or 1970s or something like that. And just as you were describing, John, they were carrying on conversations that were topical of the day. They were talking about the football game, or what's going on at the PTA, and perfect American accents. And but off to the side there were Russian agents that were like taking notes, making sure that they were hitting various different talking points and stuff like that. I guess, grading them, right? And one of the couples, or one of the, the husband or the fake wife, said something in English, but there was a very distinct like Russian phrase that was accidentally inserted into what they said, and it was like an instant tell, right? It's like, that's odd, no one in Iowa would say it just like that. Anyway, but then the scene had one of the graders, or one of the evaluators, like politely took that person outside, and a couple minutes later you hear a gunshot, like the person was killed. It's like, yeah. And it made an impact on me, just because I thought that it was so stark. But in thinking about it now, I'm like, I'm not so sure that someone would get killed for a little mistake like that after having invested years of training into this asset. But set that aside. That's number one. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think you're right. The old Soviets, the Stalin years, they killed a lot of people for very minimal reasons, but
Oh yeah.
probably not that one.
Yeah, probably not that. Here, we've spent the equivalent of millions of dollars on this person. They made a little mistake. We're going to go ahead and take that one out to pasture. Probably not. But anyway, the second thing that really made an impact on me, and I'll try to find a link to this and put it in the show notes. But evidently, the Soviets, and I'm sure we did, had our own version of this kind of thing too. But they made these really intricate maps of the United States, and they're like really beautiful maps too. But this guy found them, found a whole bunch of these maps in some dusty attic somewhere, and compiled them all into like a coffee table book. But there's, you can flip it open, and there's downtown San Francisco with Russian names on the streets, and Russian names for all the buildings and the bodies of water, et cetera, et cetera. And that's just San Francisco. The same thing for New York and Chicago and Houston, and on and on and on, all across America. These beautiful maps that were probably used for spy purposes. But anyway, it's for me at least, it is quite I don't know, interesting and mind-blowing, the extent to which these kinds of engagements are planned ahead of time and resourced.
Well, absolutely, certainly. We in the intelligence business, used to think, generally, at least in the United States, used to think that collection of secrets was the major operation of an intelligence agency. But a number of the defectors from the Soviet Union and Russia too, now for that matter, talk about influence operations as being actually the dominant goal. of the KGB.
I see. You've got I also wanted to bring in the concept of useful idiots. How does that fit into this whole discussion space?
Okay, the Soviets, going back to the Comintern, KGB certainly, and then I think we see this very clearly now with Russian and Chinese um, um, influence operations as well. They rely on people who don't fully understand the motives behind the influence operations. They don't understand the goals, if you will, of reflexive control. They are the people who are victimized and who are used. So you've got in the in the Soviet context, the hardcore of committed Marxists. Chinese case, you've got people who are absolutely loyal to the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, but you also have to have large numbers of foot soldiers, if you will, people who buy some of the disinformation and will work toward the goals of the people who are doing the influence operations. So in the context of the Soviets, for example, the term "useful idiots" is reputed to be a term that Vladimir Lenin came up with. I actually prefer one of Joseph Stalin's terms, which was a naive dupe. The people who the Soviets used were not literally idiots, but a great many of them certainly were naive. These were people who actually believed the disinformation that the Soviets were saying about, for example, how wonderful the Soviet Union was. It was a workers and peasants paradise, and so on. And because they did not know reality, because they bought the disinformation, they were willing to support the Soviet program.
Hmm. Um, so, how do you think that we can defend against these kinds of influences? And it gets thorny and sticky like real quick, right? Because I can imagine that people who could be considered useful idiots, um, if you don't take into account that they're being influenced malevolently against U.S. interests, let's say, it's not like everything that they think and believe is wrong or uh, objectionable, but maybe their overall drive and agenda. Like I said, things start getting sticky really quick on how you counter these kinds of efforts within a live culture. So what are your thoughts on that?
Okay. Well, you're getting to, I think, the critical point here. The literature and interest by policy people, by government agencies, has focused heavily on what the influence operators are doing, techniques and so on of the sort that we've talked about here for the last half an hour or so. They also talk about some standard kinds of defensive measures, things like not letting foreign countries own newspapers, for example, where they can pass on additional information. But there is a critical piece that gets to the stickiness that you're talking about here, and that is that because information operations by the Chinese and the Soviets, especially Russia, of course, is a newer country in its recent iteration. That there have been a lot of successful recruitments who are now in place in Western countries, in the United States, in Western Europe, in Australia, and elsewhere. So these people are solid citizens. They mean well, but they have become via reflexive control, where they're now making decisions unconsciously and independently in pursuit of the goals of the people who have been influencing them. Now you have a situation where you have normal, reputable, legally protected people who are becoming, in many cases, unaware, ignorant, if you will, agents of influence of malign foreign powers.
Yes, that's
How in
very, very well said. I get what you're saying. Yeah.
so how indeed do you attack? Do you attack these people? They have rights. Do you rescue them the way you might people from a cult? Do you do something else? I mean, very clearly seems to me any specific action that you might think about may run afoul of either legal or ethical issues. So this gets very, very thorny. One
Mm-hmm.
of the key areas where naive dupes are built pretty regularly is in universities. So you have now in many cases conscious agents of influence in universities who are trying to create more of themselves, as well as some naive dupes in the form of their students. So one place you want to look, seems to me, on how to reduce vulnerabilities to influence operations is universities. And the countries that are doing this, so we know very clearly that the Soviets, the Russians, and the Chinese targeting U.S. universities, because this is a way you can influence large numbers of people relatively easily, relatively cheaply, and the people you're influencing are going to be the policy and the opinion leaders of the future. So
Mm.
the fact that undergraduates are undergraduates now is not relevant to these folks. They've got long-term operations in mind. They're thinking about influencing people who are going to be running a country in another 20 or 30 years.
Mm. Right. I mean, that really is a long play, and uh, yeah. So let's say you're king for the day, or you're the president, or the provost or whatever at a university. How might you go about uh, such a project to root this kind of thing out, and you know productively, right? I mean, there's lots of third rails here, especially within a university, but we don't have to limit it, I suppose, to a university context. But universities presumably are, I mean, that's supposed to be the place where uh, any idea is legitimate. Any kind of scholastic pursuit is allowed. So how do you unravel what you're
It's
describing?
been a while since you've been at an American university.
It has, yes.
That's less and less the case now, and there are really major ongoing controversies in American universities about the extent to which freedom of speech really exists. You've heard of the term cancel culture.
I've
Uh,
heard of it, yeah.
so yes, and it's alive and it's alive and well. But how you handle that, I mean, this gets to the issues of leadership, of culture, of tenure, and so on that are very, very complicated. But in practice, a few things that one could do would be, for example, to eliminate the Confucius Institutes at American universities. There's been
Mm,
an effort by the National Association of Scholars, for example, to point out that these institutes, which ostensibly are there to pass on good things about traditional Chinese culture, Confucius, yes, but also teach Mandarin and so on. It's crystal clear now that these organizations are both influence operations and have in some cases some espionage connections. So one obvious thing you could do would be to eliminate Confucius Institutes at American universities and universities around the world. Last time I looked, there are about 500 of these globally. And then there also are Confucius schools that are at secondary schools in which the Chinese are trying, in essence, to indoctrinate younger American targets. So
Mm.
get rid of them. This is a relatively easy way to fix this. But there has been, to address this, not to fix the problem, but to
Yeah.
address.
Have I,
But there's been resistance to this in the United States and around the world. Why? For a variety of reasons. I think ideology is one of them. Money is another one. The Chinese spend a lot of money on Confucius Institutes, and universities and schools like money just like other people.
oh, I see. Yeah. So have the Confucius Institutes, by name, have they been identified by our intelligence community officially as a problem, or something to be aware of, or is this something that is not officially talked about within our intelligence community?
Well, I'm
I'm
not. Yeah,
trying to I'm trying to understand, what stakes in the ground, like, official positions have the intelligence community taken on these kinds of topics. Is it nebulous, or are there some concrete goals, I guess?
I have not seen it, I'm not in the intelligence community anymore, and if I were, I couldn't talk about it anyway. But um, uh, I have not seen an official U.S. government effort to go after Confucius Institutes. This is heavily in the private sector at this point, but it's a very public discussion. The intelligence community at congressional direction established in September of last year, 2022, a malign foreign influence center where they're tracking malign influences, and certainly Chinese influence operations must be, I think, one of them. We know too publicly that Director of CIA Burns and before him Gina Haspel identified China as the major United States intelligence focus. So given these kinds of things, I think we can count on the IC being aware of these issues. But of course, within the United States, if actors are acting consistent with U.S. law, the foreign intelligence services have no role, really. I mean, they can talk about what's happening in general, but there's no authority for CIA or any other foreign-focused intelligence service to operate against the Confucius Institutes.
I see. I mean, in a much larger, broader context, the concept of institutions in general, we had a great discussion with Yuval Levin. Oh my, it was probably 2 years ago now. We'll put a link in the show notes, but we hear a lot in the news these days about the trust in our institutions are eroding, our political institutions. You mentioned universities, but the military has typically enjoyed a favorable position amongst our institutions as a place where Americans typically still respect the military institution. But in general, our institutions are getting downgraded in their gravitas. How does all of that play into this conversation?
Well, and of course, the military is having recruiting problems, and it's dropping in polling numbers here now too. I think institutions broadly are a key part of this issue. If you go back to the 1920s, you had a number of, in essence, neo-Marxists. Antonio Gramsci of the Italian Communist Party, for example, recognized that Marx's focus on economics, capitalists and proletariat and so on, was not leading to the revolution that he hoped for, and he and then others concluded that social parts of society as a whole were better avenues by which Marxists could either exploit existing or find new create new divisions that could be exploited and lead eventually to the Marxian revolution that they all hope for. So going back a century, and this the discussion that came out and has been term that's been used repeatedly over time is the long march through the institutions. And that means then that you're going after education to help generate new generations of firm believers and naive dupes. You're penetrating the press to provide more and more disinformation that's helpful to this process. You go after the family, you go after the law. So we have critical legal studies that is reshaping law school curriculum and the views of lawyers. And you have long-standing attacks on religion too. So the Soviets made a point of going after the Roman Catholic Church, and religion is under attack as well from outsiders. So attacks on institutions are critical. And again, the ultimate goal from the Soviet perspective, not the Chinese or the Russians, but from the Soviet perspective that is still extant, is to use these attacks to totally disrupt and therefore destroy Western societies and Western civilization as we have known it.
Well, that is quite a comment on what is going on these days and how integrated it is and challenging it is to ferret it out as well. So I'd like to close out, if we may, John, and ask you to suggest. So we've got a number of students and researchers who listen to this podcast. Could you offer a productive research question that an interested student might take a crack at, which maybe could help advance our knowledge in this discussion space?
Certainly. I think we are getting toward where we want to get in terms of understanding the motives of malign attackers. I think we understand their techniques to a fair degree. We have a huge hole in understanding vulnerabilities. So what are the vulnerabilities that these attackers are exploiting? My own initial thoughts on this are that there are three sort of general categories: ideology, the Soviet effort, gullibility, creation of naive dupes in universities, and then interests, something we haven't talked here much about. The Chinese especially are using financial and other varieties of incentives to influence journalists and businesses and academics to accept and to promulgate views consistent with the CCP's positions. So I would hope that more researchers, students, and others would look at vulnerabilities, look at the vulnerabilities that these attackers identify, understand what's causing them, and then developing ways to ameliorate these vulnerabilities. So that's critical to reducing susceptibility to more attacks in the future. We can sort of shut down at least some of the attacks, but we want to make sure that the attacks that are made have as little influence as possible. And we don't really, so far as I can tell, understand this vulnerability part very well.
That is a fantastic agenda. How I usually don't ask this, but how would you go about setting up that kind of a research? I mean, how would you actually start by examining or identifying these vulnerabilities? Are we talking about like human experimentation, or are these things that can be identified in existing literature? would you go about tackling that kind of a project?
Good question, and I'm working on this, and I've only gotten a fair way into it. The interest one is probably the easiest because
Mm-hmm.
we know that the Chinese especially are using financial incentives to banks, for example, financial companies. You either push the Chinese agenda or you don't have access to the Chinese market. So we know a fair amount about that. Western banks, American, West Europeans have talked about that. And another one that's also well identified, and there'll be some ways to address this, would be visa controls. So you have the Chinese say to journalists and to academic specialists on China, unless you again toe our party line, you will not have access to Chinese leaders, to opinion makers. So therefore, your career is going to be damaged. So that's relatively easy to address, it seems to me. The ideology is another one. So but it's hard sometimes to tell who's inclined to view the different ideological views of a communist and the Marxist in the Soviet case, Russian nationalists in the Russian case, people who want to see Chinese civilization expand in the Chinese case. Ideologies are going to differ there. The critical one, though, it seems to me, is gullibility, that middle one, and that is one where you have victimization of large numbers of students in particular. So it's universities and the press that are doing this, and this gets to identifying curriculum of universities. It gets to the attitudes of professors. It gets to speech controls. It gets to allowing the Confucius Institute, for example, that will punish ethnic Chinese who go to sessions where the Dalai Lama visits, for example. So there is a major area for research, and this would be one that would be especially good, I think, for students because they're living in this environment now.
Right. And for gullibility, would you put that in the same general thought space as I don't know, being susceptible to conspiracy theories, or would you separate conspiracy? I mean, it seems to me, again, I'm far from an expert in any of this, but uh, there are certain people who tend to be susceptible to conspiracy thinking, and it again, it's one of those sticky topics because it's not like conspiracies don't exist. uh, they do, but it seems like there's a pervasiveness of conspiracy related thinking these days, and but then what you were just describing with gullibility, and let's say with students, that seems kind of different than being, falling victim to conspiracy related thinking. Would you say that
I
that's
think
right?
I think so. Certainly, there are the conspiracy theories that impress almost everybody as being kind of nutty. But you have other kinds of efforts that psychologists who looked at prisoner of war interrogations of the Chinese communists in Korea, for example. The term of art now, I think, is not brainwashing anymore, but thought reform. So when you're doing thought reform, you're not instilling conspiracy theories, but you're trying to instill a different perspective on the world. And what's pretty clearly, in my view, happening is that the three groups that I've been talking about have been trying to instill different worldviews in their target audiences that are not the same. Their aim is to advance national interests. So a key issue would be to figure out whose influence you're going to be looking at, and then looking at where your vulnerabilities are greatest, and then how to ameliorate them. So some of them will cross bounds. Young people in schools. So you you were once young, so was I. You remember what it was like to be a sophomore. Sophomores are more receptive to sometimes flaky ideas. Put it
Also,
bluntly. Don't mean to irritate people, but
as I
so
recall, sophomore translates as wise fool.
yeah. So anyway, young people are well known in many quarters anyway as being relatively susceptible to ideas that would not be persuasive to older, more experienced people. So what you want to know is since people at that age group are particularly targeted, you want to know what's going to work to alter their views in permanent, politically significant ways.
I see. This has been a real kind of a grab bag of loosely related topics during this discussion, John. It's been great. And so the last thing that I just want to ask you to comment on here is the concept, especially with China, but the concept of the diaspora, and somehow infusing into people of Chinese heritage that there is some kind of either implicit or explicit expectation of loyalty to the Middle Kingdom. How does that overlay into this either research topic or this entire discussion that we've been having?
I think it's a major issue from the Chinese perspective. If you look at the diasporas, there was almost nobody that was effective, and for the Soviets, some East European and Russians who fled the Soviet Union in 1917. And that was useful in the 20s and 30s. So the Soviets, you've got a minor Russian one now, but the Chinese diaspora, according to the statistics I've seen, number about 50 to 60 million people. So these are people of Chinese ethnicity who are living abroad, either as Chinese citizens or as citizens of other countries. And the CCP says in no uncertain terms that these people owe allegiance to the CCP as the legitimate ruler of China. And Xi Jinping, if I remember correctly, in 2014, said publicly that he regarded foreign students as being dedicated agents of influence of the CCP. So this is a huge issue.
Okay, well, all right. On that note, Dr. John Gentry, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.